Now, I want Tim to tell the story of how we got some of the oldest manuscripts from the Conquistadors. And as you probably know, Tim speaks Spanish and obviously lived in Peru for a decade, so he's pretty familiar with the landscape and the whole country and its culture. But one of the things that was fascinating is some of the documents that were provided for us were relatively hidden and obscure for 500, 550 years. So, Tim, go ahead and tell the story and take your liberty. When you're worn out or need a breath, give it back to me. But please take your liberty, because I think, Doug, this is one of the most critically important things of the time. As you quoted the book of Daniel, this is the time of the revealing, the secrets that have been hidden, and how they parallel with modern day and the expectation that God is going to deal very sternly with a nation that has forsaken him. It's got its parallels, believe it or not, in Peru, and some of the things that we're talking about. And Tim will be addressing probably in the next hour the difference between the days of Noah and what is called the antediluvian world, the pre-flood world, and the post-diluvian world. So, in essence, we've done our homework. The critics and the complainers, the whiners, the weenies, and the meow men and women should just probably listen and pray, because it's time for everyone to grow up and get with it. You know, you've lost your country. You've lost your ability to even practice your faith, as marginal as it might be or as mighty as it might be. And so tonight, I think we'll show you, again, the root of evil. So go ahead, Tim.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Hello? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So while we were in Peru on expedition in the city of Puno, which is right by Lake Titicaca, right on the banks of Lake Titicaca, we got in touch with a archaeologist, a very well-known archaeologist named Edmundo de la Vega, who's an expert on the Inca. He's an expert on the Altiplano, the high plain of Peru and Bolivia, mainly in Peru and Bolivia, which encompasses Lake Titicaca, Puno, Tiwanaku. And they put us in, we went to the university, and we wanted to speak with a very good archaeologist, somebody that can that is reputable, somebody that can lead us to certain areas that we wanted to go to, give us some background information, and they directed us to Edmundo. Edmundo himself had never really investigated as an archaeologist the idea of a race of giants having lived in Peru. So he found it really interesting that that's what we were talking about. Obviously, we were doing other things there too, investigating stargates, but one of our primary purposes wherever we go is to investigate giants and look for evidence and so forth. So he was really intrigued by this. He admitted that he himself, as an archaeologist, had never personally found any evidence for giants. But when I questioned him about historic documents relating to giants in Peru, giants in Peru, he said that yes, he had heard of historic documents relating to giants in Peru, but he had to go and do some research. And I didn't think he was really going to go research, but he did. And a couple of days later, he showed up at our hotel, and he handed me a disc. And basically, this disc, which I reviewed upon returning to Montana, contains something like a dozen chronicles from the 16th century, written by various people, all different people. And most of them were Jesuits or Dominicans, or Augustine monks from the Catholic Church. A couple of them are very well-known historians. Some of these stories are well-known if you're searching for information on giants. Some of the stuff is cited in Steve's book. But there are a few documents that I had never seen. And first of all, we had to translate the documents from Old Spanish, Old World Spanish, into New World Spanish, very similar to Old World English versus New World English. And then from English, then I translated them from Spanish into modern Spanish into English, and discovered some pretty astounding things. Basically, the documents all of the documents he sent me reference giants, specifically in Peru, and some of them reference the same story, some of them reference different stuff. But that's how I came upon those documents. And I agree with Steve. I think it's exceedingly timely. I think that it is a time lock sort of a situation here. And I don't know, Steve, if you want to go into that now or where you want me to go from here.
Continue with the narrative, because I think it's important, that people understand just how this came to be, especially with the documents, the dates, some of the, obviously, chroniclers of the conquistadors, and just lay out the scenario of what the documents on the disc provided. You can take them one by one. Obviously, the giant skull, the rapier, just take it bam, 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 and then we'll get to the timing of the Supreme Court decision and how the very document dealing with the giants and their sexual practices were dealt with.
Okay. First of all, the context of the 16th century, for those who don't know, in South America, in fact, all over the Americas, was the conquest, the Spanish and Portuguese conquest of the Americas. The Conquistadors were obviously the famous situation in Peru with Francisco Pizarro, and he conquered Peru and Bolivia and parts of Ecuador with something like 200 conquistadores, and so that's the context. These documents come from during that period, from right after that, so maybe 10, 15, 20 years after the conquest of Peru had occurred by Pizarro and his men. So Peru was under the viceroy of the Kingdom of Spain, and obviously also the Catholic Church. So that's the time frame, the 16th century. Now, I'll start with some of these documents people have heard of and are well known, but some of them I've done research and I couldn't find any references to them at all outside of what I was given, the original documents. I didn't get the original documents. I got the digital files of the original documents, which are in Lima in the library. So I'll reference this document here. This is a document called the Extirpation of Idolatry in Peru. It was written in 1620 by a man named Pablo Jose Arriaga, who was a Jesuit priest and missionary in Peru. And extirpation of idolatry just means basically the extermination of idolatry. And what was going on after the conquest in Peru was the Catholic Church, together with the Kingdom of Spain, was exterminating the religion of the natives and replacing it with Roman Catholicism. The Inquisition was already established in Peru shortly around this time, either a little bit before, a little bit afterwards. And also, besides the Inquisition, there was a group called the Visitadores, the visitors, which the visitors means the royal inspectors. The Kingdom of Spain had royal inspectors. The state had these inspectors that they sent around to do various things. In the Americas, the inspectors were often working in tandem with the Inquisition. And so you had the inspectors who were representatives of the state, and you had the Inquisition who were representatives of the church, and they were going around together, the Jesuit priests with the inspectors, with the royal inspectors, and they were exterminating all the traces of idol worship and idolatry among the native tribes in Peru after the conquest of the Inca. So this document, The Extirpation of Idolatry in Peru, 1620, by Pablo Jose Arriaga, references a very interesting story here. This Jesuit priest, Arriaga, was going around doing what I just said, and they happened to come upon a town in Peru, and in this town, as they were getting rid of the idols and everything, they were directed to go into a cave. And when they went into this cave, Arriaga, the Jesuit priest, along with the royal inspectors, found a host of dead bodies. They call them dead Gentiles, just basically referring to the natives. Found a host of dead bodies laying around on the floor, and 3 giant bodies with elongated skulls. And from other documents that reference this document, those three bodies of those giants were enshrined. And one of the other chroniclers says that they were 6 times the size of normal human beings, or the 6 times the size of the natives. And the natives were somewhere around 5'6", 5'7". The Spanish somewhere around 6 feet tall. So these are normal-sized people. These giants were up to 6 times larger than them, and they were enshrined. And there's this whole story that unfolds. And this, by the way, wasn't just recorded by the Jesuit priest. It was also officially recorded by the royal inspectors who were accompanying him. And so these giant bodies were found. And the interesting thing about this is that they talk about the giants as being the progenitors of the natives that worshiped them. So the natives were worshiping these giants with elongated skulls, and at least the natives believed that they were the progenitors that they were the offspring of those giants. Now, I don't know if the natives had elongated skulls, but certainly the giants did. And the dead natives that they talk about that were in the cave were later on in other documents, it's evident that they were human sacrifices to these giants. So this is a very interesting, obviously very interesting story that we came upon in these documents that proves a few things. It proves that the giants, at least some of the giants in Peru, had elongated skulls, which is an important piece of information when considering the elongated skull races that are found not only in Peru but Bolivia and in other parts of the earth. So it's very possible and probably very likely that they came from these giants with elongated skulls, that they were indeed their offspring. So that's one thing. The second thing is that this story confirms that the giants were worshipped, that they were worshipped as gods. And that's evident in other documents as well. But another interesting fact here is that the giants were said to have been turned into mounds. And in Peru, this was the natives' legend, including legends of the Inca themselves, that the giants were turned into stone or the giants were turned into mounds. And that's why they say in these documents, some of these historians and chroniclers, that's why the natives built the monoliths and worshipped the monoliths, because they were an effigy of the giants. And what's really, really provocative to me is that here they're talking about the giants were turned into mounds, and the natives also worshipped the mounds. But what do we know about mounds and giants from the United States, from Sardinia, from all over the world really, is that oftentimes giants are buried in mounds. So this is sort of an anecdotal piece of information that we came across, that this burying of giants in mounds is a common theme, certainly in the United States and absolutely in Sardinia, and apparently also in Peru, and therefore probably all over South America. So very likely there are many, many mounds all over the place, South America, North America, Sardinia, and everywhere else, that still to this day have giant bones buried in them. And people just don't know that they're burial mounds. But that little story in and of itself confirmed a whole bunch of details. There's another story in here. I'm flipping through these documents. There's so many of them on my screen.
Well, Tim, explain the skull size and the standard Conquistador sword size. So explain that quotation, if you will, or just give it generally, because again, This was not known. These documents, look, I've been studying giants and writing about them for 25 years. I never found them until Tim got a hold of the disc given to him by an unbelieving scholar. So the point being, please share that, Tim, because it's very critical, and then we'll take into what the giants said about the whole situation of why they were turned into mounds. Now, Jesus said, just as in the days of Noah, and he says, basically, too, in the scripture, Lot's wife turned back and looked at the judgment of God. What happened to her, Tim? She was turned into a pillar of salt. Yeah. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this is critical because, again, let's just go there right now. read. Do you want to read it, or do you want me to read it on the native legends and what the when I say the Incan legends and what they were told and what it was basically throughout South America, because I've got other reports of this, not from the guys that Tim got the source to, but please go into that and explain the timing of the whole thing of God's judgment on the giants and what they were doing. And then I'm going to read, after you're done, I'll read the quote from Diodorus Seleucus, okay?
Okay. Okay. Let me start off with what you talked about, the conquistador sword and the head, and then I'll go to the giants that got toasted basically by the angel. So Steve was talking about a head and a conquistador sword. He's referencing a story from these files that talks about a group of conquistadores that came upon a river, and the water washed away part of the bank, and it exposed a gigantic body. Now, there's this here another interesting situation that we're dealing with in these documents is a lot of people have claimed that, the bones that they found were mastodon, they're dragon bones, they're dinosaur bones, and they're not really human bones. But these documents really refute that notion, at least in Peru. Absolutely refute that notion, because in almost every case, the skulls are found with the rest of the bones, and, conquistadors were not stupid. They knew the difference between a human skull and an animal skull, a human skull, a horse skull, human skull and a cow skull, certainly a human skull and a dinosaur skull. So they found this body along the bank of a river. The water had washed away the mound or whatever was there, and it was so large that one of the conquistadores stuck their rapiers, their sword, in through the eye socket, and it says that the tip of that sword barely touched the back of the skull of this giant. In other words, it went in through the eye socket and through the head, through the cranial cavity, and barely touched the other end of that skull, the interior of that skull. So I forget how long a blade is on an average rapier, Steve, like 35 inches or something like that.
No, actually, it's 40. Hey, Tim, it's 42 inches.
Yeah, and we, as Steve said, we're going to actually demonstrate that in the documentary so people can see the scale. So we're dealing with not, a 7.5-foot giant or an 8-foot giant. We're dealing with 15-plus foot giants. In some cases in these documents, they're talking about 20 to 30-foot giants, really, really, really huge, human-like beings with human-like skulls. That's what we're dealing with. And according to these chroniclers, some of whom are, and I'll mention some of them a little later on, some of whom are very reputable historians, these giants were there, their bones were there, and it was common knowledge during the conquest of Peru and after the conquest of Peru, and of course the Inca knew all about this. And so there's a very famous story. Steve, I think I'll you want me to nutshell this story, and then are you going to read an excerpt from it?
I want you to read the excerpt. Tim, I want you to read the excerpt, and then I'm going to read Diodorus Seleucus on the whole issue that we're making tonight, the timing of this, of the giants being destroyed because of their sodomy is made known to you, hasn't been made known to me. I never knew the situation existed in that because, number one, I don't read Spanish. Number two, the documents couldn't have turned up unless somebody turned them over to us. So that's what I want you to read. Remember the one I just sent you? Yep.
Yes. Okay, so this is a document by a very famous Augustan monk. It was written in 1663. It's called The Moral Chronicle of the Order of St. Augustine in Peru, and this person is considered, Antonio de la Calancha is his name, is considered a reliable source of information. And this is, I'm going to read a portion here. Now, it's a little bit long, so bear with me. I'm going to read this. Speaking of the giants that existed before or after the flood in these native lands, and it's true that after the flood they existed in the New World, and it is said that it was well known that there were giants that came from other parts whose greatly deformed bones are still found to this day near Puerto Viejo. And according to their proportion, they had to be men in stature more than 3 times the size of the Indians today. Some of the documents say 6 size. There's different references. They say that these giants came from over the sea and that they made war with those on the land and that they raised mighty edifices or buildings, some of the stones of which still stand today in testimony of their greatness. They also say that these giants, being terrible sinners, practicing incest and sodomy, were burned and consumed with fire that came from heaven. This is the witness of Father Torquemada, and Theodore de Bry also references this, and Theodore de Bry also references the same in his book entitled, and it's a Latin title. Added to this are the known traditions that all of these giants, whose bones are seen to this day in that beautiful place, died in flames, because a young, handsome man, and then in quotations it says, these Indians did not know of the existence of angels, threw lightning down upon them and incinerated all of them, leaving only their bones so that they would remain as a dreadful witness. For other Indians in those provinces, it is common knowledge that because they were sodomites, God turned their remains into large stones that are today dispersed over the land and charred black. And they say that it happened only a short time before the Spanish entered Peru. This news is not new to me, nor do I find it hard that the sodomites would be turned to stone when I see that Lot's wife was turned into a pillar of salt by God because she turned her eyes back to Sodom and was punished for looking back. And thus it is possible that these punishments also befell these giants because of their sin. So this is a story that is referenced in literally every one of these documents. Now, this particular story was made popular by Cieza de Leon, who was a Spanish traveler traveling through the Americas after the conquest. And Cieza de Leon actually writes in great detail concerning these giants. He talks about how, and so do these other guys reference this, how these giants actually ate 5 times the amount of food as the amount of meat as the regular natives, and then they ate the natives. And they came from over the sea, and they didn't have women. They didn't bring women for some reason with them. And so they tried to make use of the natives' women in sexual terms, but killed them, in the process, obviously. And so they turned to sodomy. They became sodomites, and they were hated. The Indians hated these natives. And I'm paraphrasing all this from Cieza de Leon and all these documents that reference these giants. There's so much information on them. In fact, the houses that the giants built are described in these documents, and some of them were still standing during this time period, during the mid-16th century. These houses were still standing, and they described these houses, what they look like, and they described seeing them standing there still, and everybody knew, it was common knowledge, those are the houses of the giants, of the sodomite giants, who God destroyed with fire and lightning. And so this, again, was very well known. Now, this story is well known. It's on the internet. Even the English translation of Cieza de Leon's version is on the internet, is well known. You can find it, and it's been quoted many times. But what's not well known is that the Conquistadors actually proved that it was true. That's what's really astounding, and that nobody mentions, because I've done some research to see if these documents are ever referenced, and I found that some of them are, maybe half of them are, the other half are nowhere to be found, and as far as I can tell, on the internet. And one of these, I'm trying to pull up a document here as I talk. There was a guy named Captain Juan Olmos, who was the lieutenant governor at Puerto Viejo, which is in Santa Elena. By the way, Santa Elena is where these giants landed, these sodomite giants, that's where they landed. Santa Elena was at the time part of the province of Peru, part of the province of Peru. It is now Ecuador. So some people probably have heard this story, and Steve has actually referenced this story in the past. It is now Ecuador. It was Peru. So, and Santa Elena is close to the city of Guayaquil. And you'll see there's a peninsula there if you look on Google Maps. And that's where this occurred. And I say occurred and not allegedly occurred because, as I said, it was proven. Captain Juan Olmos, who was a native of Trujillo, back in the in the mid 16th century, in 1555, somewhere around there. It says, and I'll just read this. This is a document by Agustin de Zarate. Captain Juan Olmos, native of Trujillo, hearing all of these things, conducted an excavation in that valley. Speaking of that valley where the giants were destroyed by God for being sodomites, where he found such gigantic ribs and other bones that if the heads had not been found with them, it would not have been believable that they were human beings. And thus, by his own investigation and seeing the signs of the lightning that punished them, he confirmed what the Indians had said to be true. And he sent throughout the diverse regions of Peru some of the teeth that they found there, each one of which measured 3 fingers in width and 4 in length. So here now we have a historical account of Captain Juan Olmos, who, having heard all these stories about these giants in the province that he was governor of, decided to dig down to either prove the story to be a myth or it's true. He dug down, he found the bones of giants, and not just the bones. For all the skeptics, he found the skulls with the bones, and he would not have believed that they were giants if he had not found the skulls. But because he found the skulls, he could not deny that these were the giants that the natives were talking about. The story was true, and he found evidence that they had been destroyed in the manner that the story says. So then of course he sent the teeth all over the different provinces of Peru to his compadres to confirm that yes, this story that you're hearing about over and over and over is in fact true. So again, a lot of people know about Cieza de Leon's account of these giants, but very few people know that it was confirmed to be true.